Florida moves closer to permitless carry as Beto flounders in Texas. Plus, an interview with Professor Bernick on the charges against Michigan school shooters' parents. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I am your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can sign up for a membership today to help support our independent and informed reporting on firearms policy and politics with your membership, which will get you access to exclusive posts, dozens of exclusive posts that feature my analysis of Jake Charles, other writers, as well as exclusive stories. And you'll get this podcast a day early if you sign up. So this week, we're taking on an interesting story, which is the school shooting, the horrible school shooting that happened in Michigan, has now resulted not only in charges against the shooter, but also his parents for their negligence. So I wanted to have on an expert. On this show, we'd like to have on people who actually have some knowledge of what they're talking about and experience in the areas that we're discussing. So to that end, we've got Evan Bernick from, he's a professor at the Northern Illinois University College of Law. He's associate professor there. Evan, can you tell the audience just a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, Stephen. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm excited to have a conversation with you. I teach criminal law and procedure at Northern Illinois, and I also teach constitutional law and legislation. I'm also very actively involved in efforts to transform the criminal legal system in ways that are more fair, more equitable, and more just for people who are disproportionately burdened by it at present, which tends to be racial minorities, which is why I wrote the article that I did and I took the position that I did. And I'm looking forward to discussing this case with you to explain my perspective a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. You had a piece in the Washington Post that talked about potential consequences of charging these parents in this case, especially as it pertains to the use of that kind of prosecution in the future against minorities, which is something that we've talked about on this show in regards to the arguments in the Supreme Court case over New York's May issue law. You've seen a number of briefs in that case from both the National African American Gun Association and also from the Public Defenders group up in New York that argues that law has disproportionate impact on especially young African American men. And so in this case, obviously the parents and the shooter, the accused shooter himself, who murdered a number of his classmates, is a horrific crime. One of the worst school shootings we've seen in several years now. But the parents are being charged in addition to the son, which is fairly unusual. It's not something that you see very often in these cases. Can you just give us a little bit of background on the law question here?
So I would go further than say it's unusual. It is extraordinary. No parent has ever been charged or convicted of a homicide offense in connection with their child's mass shooting. Mm-hmm. So this prosecution has already broken new grounds, and convicting the parents would certainly break new ground. Now, what are they specifically being charged with? They're being charged with involuntary manslaughter. Involuntary manslaughter is a felony that's punishable by up to 15 years in prison. And in Michigan, although the standards in other states differ in various ways that we might get into, the minimal mental state, mens rea, intention that you have to have in order to be convicted of the offense is gross negligence. You have to be grossly negligent, and your gross negligence needs to cause the death of another person. Gross negligence means you've fallen way, way, way below the standard of care that a reasonable person would take, and you have been culpably ignorant of a substantial and unjustified risk. This is more than just falling below the standard that a reasonable person would take, which could get you liability for a civil suit. It's really, really, really falling below it. It needs to cause death.
Right. And you provide an example in your piece at the Washington Post for a circumstance where this has been applied to a shooting.
Yes.
And it was a father leaving a shotgun loaded and easily accessible to his young children, and then one of them shot the other one in an accidental shooting.
Yes.
And he was convicted under this same standard.
Right.
But you don't find the actions of the Crumbleys, in this case, the parents, to meet that same standard. Or is that right? Like, given what we know about them so far?
So I want to be careful here with suggesting that the prosecution is going outside the law to bring these charges. Mm-hmm. Common law is developed by, well, it's frankly developed by prosecutors and judges, but it's ultimately, in the cases that are decided, developed by judges who decide what counts as gross negligence and what doesn't.
Sure.
Before this case, before People v. Head, there weren't really any cases that were particularly similar to this one. But then there was Head, and now the prosecution has a plausible argument that they can rely upon to bring these charges. However, there are certain important differences between these cases that the defense is almost sure to raise as this develops. We should keep in mind that the fact that whether this case goes to trial or not, that's not assured. Most cases don't. So this case may not result in an opinion that really examines Head that's the name of this case, to determine whether this is within the scope of that. But the important differences here there are a couple of them that are very relevant. First of all, we're dealing with an accidental shooting in that case. We're dealing with an accidental shooting by a 10-year-old girl who's not competent to use firearms by any stretch of the imagination. That followed...
Not unsupervised, at least.
Unsupervised. Right? That followed very directly from accessing the short-barreled shotgun that was unlocked and that was in this playroom. So what are the differences between that case and this one? Well, the big difference is that this is, as the prosecution has presented it, a series of deliberate killings for which the shooter is being charged and is an adult for first-degree murder. First-degree murder. So we're not talking about just a negligent failure to keep the gun secure. We're talking about, the prosecution is alleging, a series of failures on the parts of the parents to intervene and to prevent their child from killing a number of people deliberately. And regardless of Head, that is going to be a difficult case to prove because of the issue of causation. Even if the parents fell way below the standard of care that a reasonable person would take under these circumstances, there's the question of whether their negligent failure actually caused, in the sense relevant to criminal law, the deaths of these children. One of the things that can break the chain of causation in criminal cases, and even in civil cases, quite frankly, is deliberate action by a third party that counts as an intervening event. So, whereas in Head, we have negligent failure to keep guns secured, leading to an accidental killing in the same room as the gun of another child by a child. Here we have a child deciding to get into this unsecured area, to take this gun to school, and then to deliberately kill several other people. To show that the parents' omissions, their failures to intervene, caused the deaths of those children is going to be a difficult thing for the prosecution to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. certainly, and I imagine that's why you don't see a lot of these kinds of cases after school shootings or mass shootings that involve minors. But I will say that in this case, you had the parents bought the gun for their son as a Christmas gift, from what we know, or at least what prosecution is saying. And they were once warned about him looking for ammunition on his phone while he was at school. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily going to be something that indicates he's going to carry out a school shooting, but it was an issue that the school had already brought up once. And then on the day of the shooting, my understanding is, he was found to have drawn notes that indicated he was going to commit a mass shooting. Now, these were drawings, but they showed essentially scenes of killing. I believe they had notes that wrote, blood everywhere, please help make the voices stop, things that are extremely disconcerting and indicate, could, to any reasonable person, could indicate that this child is suffering a severe mental health episode that could lead to violence, specifically violence committed with the gun that the parents bought. And when the parents were called into the school and told about this, they did not remove the alleged shooter from school. They left him in school that day. They didn't check his backpack or check whether or not the gun that they had bought for him was in fact at home where it was supposed to be. And it turned out that, and so he was sent back to class, and he had the gun on him that entire time, from what we understand. And then he carried out that shooting that day. So, it obviously these do seem like pretty damning facts as far as at least how incredibly irresponsible the parents were. Now, you could also suggest perhaps that the school should have done more in this circumstance as well. And maybe that plays into their defense. The school didn't think it was serious enough to keep him out of class, I guess. So maybe there'll be more that comes out, but those facts are pretty damning, right?
So 2 points. I want to frame this as gently as possible, but it is an important point to keep in mind when we're reporting upon decisions by prosecutors to bring charges. These are not facts. They are allegations. They have not been proven in a court of law. We have heard only one side of the story. We have heard the prosecution side. With that out of the way, if what the prosecution says is true, this is an egregious case of an astonishing irresponsibility on the part of the shooter's parents. The question that I raise in my article, and that I'm primarily concerned with, is not just this case, but future cases where, in a context where a principle has been accepted at a certain level of generality, parents can be held accountable as felons for the crimes of their children, and what kind of impact that has on people who are not the Crumblies. Because this case has received a ton of attention. People are monitoring it very carefully, but it will drop off the radar. And when it drops off the radar, the exercise of prosecutorial discretion is going to be operating in ways that people are not always able to see. 92 to 95% of criminal adjudications never see the lights of a courtroom. They are pled out. Prosecutors bring charges. There are what are euphemistically described as plea bargains, but really they are coerced agreements. If you just invoke your Sixth Amendment right to trial by jury, you face the prospect of a harsher punishment than you would face if you voluntarily plead guilty and accept the punishment the state has specified for the offense. So In that setting, we're not just worried about, the facts of a case that we are aware of possibly stretching the law. We have to worry that facts are never going to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt at all. We have to assume that whatever law is created by this case is going to be stretched. And we have to price that into our decision about how to think about this case right now, rather than simply saying, which I'm not suggesting that you're saying this, but it is an argument that gets raised in this context. Yes, but this case is particularly egregious. In the context of the criminal law, you can never just think about this case. You've got to think forward, and you've got to think about the cases that you're not seeing.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like your main concern here, and certainly it comes across in the piece, is about the sort of precedent that this prosecution is going to set, even if it doesn't make it to trial, perhaps. Just the fact that prosecutors might try this more and more aggressively down the line is going to have an impact. And obviously in your piece, you're particularly concerned about the kind of people or who is going to be impacted by some of these perhaps even more dubious prosecutions down the line. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So in candor, I must say that my starting point does a lot of work in terms of like the disposition that I take towards proposed expansions of the criminal law in any setting. The starting point is that American law right now makes too many people into criminals. It punishes them too harshly, and it punishes them in ways that either have the purpose or the effect of disproportionately burdening racial minorities. That's why we have a burgeoning prison population that is unprecedented in size in our own national history and is internationally distinctive. And that's why that prison population is disproportionately constituted by racial minorities, and in particular Black Americans. Now, one of the reasons that the criminal law does these things is because prosecutors have a great deal of discretion. They have too much discretion. They have too much discretion who to prosecute, what to charge, and whether those charges are ever subject to adversarial testing. So I come in with a strong presumption against virtually any expansion of criminal law. If I see a proposed statute that makes more people into criminals, I presume that it's going to do more harm than good. If I see a decision by a prosecutor who's making novel charging decisions, I presume that it's not a good idea, even if it's within the letter of the law. But I do look more closely into it to determine whether there really is specific cause for concern that this law or this prosecutorial decision will exacerbate the problem that I've identified with racially disproportionate incarceration and punishment. And in this case, I do see things that raise concerns.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this with Adam Serwer from The Atlantic on the podcast a little while back, sort of the racial disparity and guns, and really race and guns in America. But there actually was just a new report released from the Bureau of Justice Statistics that from the Urban Institute that looked at federal prosecution of gun crimes, federal gun crimes, and the conviction rates. And you do see this because, frankly, I think this is one of the areas when discussing criminal justice reform and disparate impact of the legal system on minorities that kind of gets ignored, honestly, a lot of the time. But it's very clearly the case that African Americans, especially African American men, are disproportionately impacted by federal gun laws. At the very least, this report, they found that of those who were convicted of federal firearms possession charges, 49% were Black, 30% are white, 19% Hispanic. Now, Black Americans, they only make up, according to the Census Bureau, 13.4% of the population. So obviously being the largest demographic as far as federal prosecution of gun possession crimes goes, doesn't match with the proportion of the population that they are. Now, there's also obviously a huge disparity in gender here, and 97.7% of federal firearms offenders are men. So that's even bigger disparity, but still, it's something that doesn't get talked a lot about. I do think it's interesting in both this particular case with the Crumbleys and these federal crimes. The underlying crime might be something that most people would agree should be a crime. I mean, in these federal cases, you're talking about possession of firearms by people who are convicted felons. Now, there's certainly some debate over whether or not non-violent felons should have lifetime prohibitions on gun ownership. And there's even some people who would argue that you shouldn't have a lifetime prohibition after you've served your time for whatever crime you committed, even if it was a violent felony. But I think most Americans probably support these measures. But you do see a very clear problem with distribution of justice in this case. It can't be the case that there's no racial aspect going on here.
Right. And I framed my arguments in a way that was designed to present for readers who consider themselves progressive and who also consider themselves opponents of mass incarceration a choice. You can have the expansion of criminal law to cover this territory, or you can have a genuine across-the-board commitment to reducing our prison population. But you cannot have both. It may be worth it. You may consider that in order to express our moral outrage or to deter future parents from engaging in negligent activity or any number of justifications for the punishment that the Crumbleys are facing, you may say, well, it's worth it. It is worth swelling our prison population in a way that disproportionately burdens minorities in order to prevent mass shootings. But you need to be clear-eyed that that's the kind of decision that you're making. And once you're thinking about the decision in those terms, you just might want to consider alternatives that don't present the same risks. And I think that there are alternatives that do not present the same risks.
Yeah. Well, one, I think that point is especially salient. People often don't consider the real world consequences of the sorts of laws that they are proposing, especially, in my opinion, when it comes to gun laws. You've seen this, I think, as we briefly mentioned at the beginning of this interview, with may issue concealed carry laws in places like New York, which public defenders put a brief in that indicated, in real life, I think a lot of people, especially on the left or on the side of, gun safety, as they prefer to call it, right? Gun safety groups or gun control groups, however you want to call them. They like the concept of, well, if anyone is going to carry a gun in public, which a lot of them don't think anybody should really. And that's, that's a fair enough position to have. But if anyone is going to have it, they should be, especially vetted, and police should get a say over whether or not they can do it, which is effectively how these laws work. And in practice, that means that most people can't get a permit. And then what that means, especially in neighborhoods where people feel unsafe, which oftentimes is the case in low income and minority neighborhoods in cities like New York, a lot of people are going to turn to carrying guns illicitly because they can't get the permits to do it legally. And you're going to have a lot of people who get arrested just for that, not because they've done anything else. Or there's any evidence that they were committing a crime with their gun beyond possessing it. Or that they had a history of any sort of violent crime. And that's the reality of this situation. And I believe the public defenders even went so far as to say that the Second Amendment effectively doesn't exist for certain groups of people like that.
It says that the licensing process has been riven with racist assumptions from its inception, and that today it basically serves as a means by which former NYPD officers can acquire guns legally, and pretty much everybody else is left outside of the space that's protected by the Second Amendment. You have the way to concretize kind of this dissonance that sometimes goes on the left about this is you're not going to find somebody on the left who is a proponent of stop and frisk and who doesn't think that it's a constitutional abomination. Stop and frisk was as abusive as it was in significant part because officers had grounds under which that they could basically assume that anybody who had a firearm who did not go through the appropriate channels was carrying that firearm illegally and could be stopped and frisked and the weapons could be removed from the streets.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, effectively, it was a policy to enforce New York's may issue concealed carry law. That's what most people.
Exactly.
That's what a lot of the people got arrested for is simple possession, not because they had any evidence that those people were intending to rob somebody or do anything else other than protect themselves.
Right. Absolutely. And I stress that stuff like this can happen without anybody consciously intending it.
Right.
It doesn't need to be a intentionally malicious scheme that is developed to disenfranchise or disempower Black Americans, although there's relevant history that suggests that at least at certain junctures it was.
Sure. The Mulford Act in California, for example, was specifically targeted at Black Panthers in the 1960s, which banned open carry in California. There were certainly explicitly racial motivations for that law. And obviously some people also argue the same thing with the Sullivan Law in New York, as far as that's the case that's in front of the Supreme Court right now.
But even if they're not, the structural factors that lead to low-income urban communities being disproportionately inhabited by Black Americans that then feel the need to protect themselves is going to lend itself to a disproportionate impact of restrictive gun laws on Black Americans, regardless of anybody's malign intentions to specifically disenfranchise them. And one of the things that I talk about in my article is I don't say, look, I think that Prosecutor McDonald is even thinking about race in this context, but she doesn't need to be thinking about it in order for the decision that she makes to legitimize an expansion of the criminal law that is going to have a disproportionate impact on Black Americans. And that's why I wrote this, to make sure that the stakes are plain and that they're out there. So at a moment when everybody is focused on this, as opposed to a moment in which people have turned their attention to other things, we can have that kind of forthright discussion about this. Instead of hastily embracing an expansion of criminal law that will give a certain amount of satisfaction under the circumstances, but is going to lead to consequences down the road that we'll regret to the extent that we keep them, that we follow them at all.
Yeah, obviously, I think a lot of people will immediately question the racial aspect going on here just because, obviously, the Crumbleys are not Black. Certainly, but I do think that you have a cogent argument about how expanding this particular the prosecution for this crime, expanding what constitutes negligent homicide in this way, could have an impact down the line in the same way that we've seen. Federal gun laws have a disproportionate impact on minorities. And just to
concretize that concern a little bit, the concern is that stereotypes involving Black parental responsibility have demonstrably influenced the operation of the criminal law over the course of decades. And to the extent that those stereotypes are still believed and acted upon, an expansion of the criminal law that says that under certain circumstances, parents can be held responsible for the criminal acts of their children is going to fall disproportionately on Black Americans because of those stereotypes. By the same token, you notice in this case that the shooter is being charged as an adult. Black children are disproportionately likely to be charged as adults because they are often perceived as being more mature and more calculating. So you have in this mix, in this area of expansion of criminal liability, two operative stereotypes. Black children are more mature, black parents are irresponsible. Once you imbibe those stereotypes, or if you assume that prosecutors will sometimes act on them, you have a potent mix for racially disparate prosecution that is based on parental irresponsibility stemming from criminal acts of children.
Right. And you cite a number of statistics in your piece about that. Obviously, it's a controversial topic that has really been at the center of a lot of our national political debate for a while, some of these concepts. But and we're not going to solve all that here today on this.
Really?
This show,
I thought we were going to. No, it's good.
But certainly people should read what you've written on that front and decide for themselves as far as those concerns go. I think certainly the statistics would indicate there's at least some truth to what you're saying here. Whether or not people would how far along that path they go is another question entirely, right? But you do offer up a solution in the piece, which I think we also have some disagreement over, perhaps, which is that safe storage laws are a better solution in this case for, I guess, holding parents accountable when children get unsupervised access to firearms and then use them to kill people, specifically in this case. First off, can you just say why you think that would be a better solution than these charges that the Crumblies are facing?
I'm worried about the creep of a broad principle that parents can be held accountable for the criminal acts of their children. That is my principal animating worry in this setting. The relative advantage, and I want to stress that I don't come out and endorse safe storage laws. I say that they are compared to what I regard as a very dangerous expansion of criminal liability, something that is more cabins. They are tied to specific failures on the part of parents that cause to keep guns stored and secured, that cause shootings by a child or the shooting of a child. So instead of worrying about the possibility that the failure on the part of a parent to intervene in his son's gang behavior is going to lead to criminal liability if the kid beats somebody up in the context of a gang initiation, at least you have something that is tethered to a specific failure that is relevant to the problem of mass shootings that we're trying to address in this setting. So without endorsing the safe storage laws, which exist in about 30 states, including the District of Columbia, and which Michigan is probably going to reconsider, I suggest that the relative risk of harm is less.
I see. So, because obviously you could make the same point here that we've been talking about all along about how this would be accomplished in practice or how it'd be carried out in practice, and it would probably have a disproportionate impact on minorities even still, even though it's more focused. But I suppose you're just saying that in this case, that's a better option than creating a wholesale principle about parents' responsibility for their children's criminal actions. I'm of two minds on it. Obviously, if you're a gun owner and a parent, you should keep your firearms inaccessible to your children. But usually, in most cases, it seems to me that adding a criminal responsibility on top of the parents' responsibility, because most mass shootings are quite rare. School shootings remain rare. Obviously, we all would want them to be zero, just like we'd want all violence to go to zero. And there's plenty of debate to be had over how to get to that point. But I always, whenever I think of safe storage laws, beyond the fact that they often would burden people who don't have children and really aren't the business of anyone but that person inside their home, I wonder how much of a deterrent it really is to charge a parent after their kid has killed themselves with a gun that they left on. Like how much added deterrence is that, I mean, probably keeping your children alive would be the deterrent to leaving your guns unsecured or keeping your child from, in this case, committing a horrible act of, just murder, but maybe worse than, it's just an unimaginable act like this. So, but at the same time, it's also, when I look at the charges against them, certainly I do very much sympathize with your point of view on this, as far as the creating this new principle and the effects that that's going to have down the line. But you obviously, when you look at the facts of this case, and most people think, well, these parents, something should be done to these parents. They were that wildly irresponsible. Immediately, they had an immediate. And again, your point about this is what the prosecutors are saying, and I don't know that I fully buy what the prosecutors are saying, because why did the school not do more in that case as well? That's very odd that the school had these notes and these warnings and let him go back to why would that be something the school would allow? Right. In addition to something that the parents would allow, obviously. And why did no one search his backpack? Right. So on and so forth. There's a lot of questions that remain unanswered. But if it turns out to be true, certainly the parent, we all, I'm sure, feel the parents in this situation were horrifically irresponsible to the point where we'd like to see something done about it. I guess but to your point again, it's something that you have to consider the consequences down the line of that. I will also, there's one more point before we wrap things up here that I do find interesting. It's something I brought up with Adam Serwer at the time. And, obviously we're two white guys, so I don't have insight into what African Americans think on this topic or, have perfect explanation for this, and I'm sure you don't either. And obviously, African Americans don't all think the same way about things. Certainly, they're not monolith, but you do see oftentimes much higher support for restrictive gun laws among African Americans, even though they're quite aware of the issues that we've talked about on this podcast, the issues of disproportionate conviction rates for African Americans with these exact kind of gun laws that they support. So that's another wrinkle to all this that I wonder about. Like, what do you think drives that, and how do you respond to it when you're thinking about criminal justice reform?
Rather than speculate about it directly, I want to make an analogy based on a book that was written by James Foreman Jr. called Locking Up Our Own, that talks extensively about overwhelming in the Black community, at least in the formative years of what's now referred to as the war on drugs, for really draconian restrictions on drug use and punishment for drug dealers. There were early efforts to basically see the writing on the wall and draw attention to the problem of mass criminalization, and to develop intercommunity means of responding to the harms wrought by drugs that did not involve the criminal legal system. But what Foreman documents very convincingly, to my mind, is that there was an important sense in which many members of the Black community wanted something that decades later is regarded by most Black Americans and really most a great deal of thoughtful observers of all races, colors, and creeds as something that, whatever the initial intentions, has wrought a tremendous amount of damage on the Black community. So when I'm confronted with beliefs about what ought to be and what ought not to be illegal from people whose lived experiences are very different from mine, I try my best to understand them and appreciate that there's going to be an epistemic gap that is in important respects unbridgeable, but also to emphasize that there are lots of situations where lots of people of varying races, colors, and creeds want things that do a great deal of harm, even with the best of intentions. So
Right.
my response to that is, look, there's a democratic process that we're all going to have to be part of in discussing the questions of what we ought to do here. And the voices that are calling for more restrictive gun laws and those who are concerned about them because of the racial impact that I've discussed are going to need to have conversations, and those are going to be difficult conversations. And the only thing that I can say with respect to them is that that's how we need to be if we're serious about democracy, rather than, either erasing people's experiences or simply saying, well, if that's what, fill in the blank, these people want, then that's what we ought to do. We should be critically evaluating popular intuitions about all sorts of things, regardless of who the people are in any particular circumstances.
Right. And I think Adam's response, who obviously Adam is African-American, but his explanation I thought was pretty reasonable in terms of, Black Americans understand the issues with the criminal justice system and with disproportionate prosecution of Black Americans, but at the same time they also deal with in many Black communities the violence that can be associated with firearms or gun violence, and so there's a lot of balancing that goes on into. It's a lot like similar to the debate over defunding the police, right? I think a lot of Black Americans view police brutality as an extremely serious issue. Of course, that's plainly obvious from the last year and a half, but and obviously well before then. But at the same time, many Black Americans want more police presence when they want to live in safe neighborhoods as well, and so there is a tension there, but it's a sort of tension that everyone deals with, right? To a certain degree, of balancing these different competing concerns that might you go too much one way or too much the other way, and it creates a problem that you're not intending to. So if that all makes sense, it's not exactly a total brain melting contradiction here. It's just I just want to be careful not to because oftentimes when I talk about these issues and race and gun laws, it makes it. I don't want it to sound too much like it'd be crazy for any African American not to agree with my position on what this should be. Right. I just like to bring up the fact that not just because these points are salient or they make sense doesn't. That's not the whole story, I guess, is what I try to get at with that. But I really appreciate you being on. You actually have a book that I think my listeners might be interested in because in some ways it actually connects with the Supreme Court case going on right now on gun carry, because your book is about the 14th Amendment, which is actually a pretty relevant point being brought up in, especially by the U.S. Solicitor General in the gun carry case, where they argue that the ratifiers of the 14th Amendment were also the same people who passed a lot of these concealed carry laws that had good reason, exceptions to them. These may issue laws that are currently being decided right now. So tell us a little bit about that and where people can buy that book. Sure.
So this book, co-authored by myself and Randy Barnett, purports to be the definitive accounts of the original meaning of the 14th Amendment's primary individual rights protecting clauses. These are the privileges or immunities clause, the due process of law clause, and the equal protection clause. Talks about the development of the 14th Amendment, how it was informed by a constitutional theory that was initially developed by abolitionists and then later taken up by the Republican Party, which held that all people were entitled to baseline protection against both public and private violence, protection against arbitrary deprivations of their life, liberty, and property by the government. And citizens specifically, U.S. citizens, were entitled to certain rights that were stable, widely accepted by the states, and closely associated with citizenship. And although we don't go into great detail about specific rights in our book, Randy and I feel comfortable claiming that one of those rights was the individual right to bear arms in self-defense. This was a right that had been persistently violated both during the antebellum period and during the Reconstruction era by the Confederates and then formerly Confederate states. That the Black codes that were developed in the wake of the Civil War specifically targeted Black Americans for disarmament while leaving them at the mercy of extra governmental forces, namely the Ku Klux Klan, who did have guns and who did use them. And one of the things that I do think is value about the Solicitor General's brief is that it focuses the public's attention on what was going on in 1868 when it comes to understanding the rights guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, rather than just looking back to the founding era in 1791 with the original Bill of Rights. Because a lot happened in the meantime. The contours of the rights changed in certain important respects, and the understanding of the value of those rights and the importance of them changed as well. And if we don't focus on those changes, we risk erasing a history of constitutional struggle, and we also risk giving people now less rights than are actually protected by the Constitution.
No, I mean, that sounds like a really fascinating book, frankly. Where can people pick it up?
People can pick it up on Amazon. It's published by Harvard University Press under their Belknap imprints. And what can I say? You definitely should find a way to fit it in your stocking.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate you being on. I think you're very thoughtful, and I thought this was a really good interview. So we'll have to have you on again sometime in the future as well.
I'd be glad to, Stephen. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Okay, now it's time for the news update from thereload.com, where you can go over and buy membership today if you want to get exclusive access to the members-only pieces. We have dozens and dozens of those at this point, and you'll also get early access to this podcast, if that's something you're interested in, and the chance to be on the podcast. We got to have another member on soon so that this becomes a more relevant talking point in these little ad sales. we've done a number of them, but we'll have to do some soon here, right, Jake?
Yeah.
So that this,
I encourage you guys to reach out. It's a fun segment.
If you want to be on the podcast, if you're already a member, just email me. Reply to your Sunday newsletter, which is another, again, perk of being a member. You get a whole exclusive newsletter with the analysis of the week's events from me and Jake here, Jake Fogelman, our contributing writer. And Jake, you have a story to start us off with for the news update out of Texas, right?
That's right. Big new poll heading into the gubernatorial race that's coming up next year. Obviously, a lot of eyes are on Texas because there's been a ton of talk last several years now about possibly that state flipping blue. And so a lot of national eyes are on the state of Texas. Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of national interest, obviously, we've covered Beto O'Rourke, tossed his name in there to challenge incumbent Greg Abbott. And so we have our first big poll from a major pollster. Quinnipiac has a new poll right now out of Texas registered voters. And it's not looking so well for Beto O'Rourke at this point.
No,
Greg Abbott has
it's still early, just to preface this.
It is still early.
But
don't let me get ahead of myself.
But the numbers are pretty bad, right? So what exactly was the breakdown?
Yeah, so the overall favorability, Abbott has a 15-point lead. It's, I think, 52% for Abbott and 37% say they prefer O'Rourke. But what's even more striking is they polled specifically the issue of gun policy. And I think it was primed, regardless of who you intend to vote for, who do you think will handle gun policy better? And Greg Abbott enjoyed a staggering 27-point lead on that issue in particular. Which doesn't bode well for Beto O'Rourke and his pretty radical strategy so far on the issue of guns.
Yeah, that's a huge lead. This is kind of what everybody predicted, though, I guess. We had Adam Serwer on the podcast from The Atlantic, who lives down in Texas, who's a center-left guy, or whatever you want to put him in the political world. He's not a conservative, right? And he thought that Beto would have to change his position on guns to have a real chance in Texas. And it seems like that's exactly what's happening because, right? So we had Beto come out in 2020 during the primary and declare that he was going to take everyone's AR-15s and AK-47s. He made it was a direct declaration that, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15s and AK-47s is the exact quote. And that didn't work for him in the Democratic presidential primary, but he hasn't walked it back since since putting his hat in the ring for the Texas gubernatorial nomination. And it's pretty surprising to see. In fact, he's kind of doubled down on it. And his response is to say that Greg Abbott, the incumbent Republican, is actually the gun extremist and that we have too much gun extremism because Abbott signed permitless carry into law in Texas. So I guess voters are not going along with this, at least not yet, right?
Yeah, they don't seem to be persuaded that Abbott is the extremist in this case. If you look at the numbers even further, they break it down by different demographic groups on that same question. And across the board, every age demographic from young voters to those over 65, all sizable majorities say Abbott will handle gun policy better. Hispanic voters say the same, both men and women, those with and without college degrees, all say the same thing. I believe it was only black voters that said that they preferred Beto O'Rourke on the issue of gun policy. So it wasn't a total wash, but it's just pretty staggering.
They preferred him pretty strongly, if I remember correctly from reading your piece.
I believe it was 72% said that they thought that O'Rourke would handle the issue.
So that's
better.
an interesting racial breakdown there as well, with black Texans being pretty divergent from the rest of the state in terms of their views on gun policies of the two candidates. But I guess Beto's strategy here, I guess the good news you would take away from this poll, perhaps, I mean, whatever good news you can take away from a poll where you're losing by 15 points, is that guns were not the number one issue.
That's right.
Right. So because the people said that there were three other issues that were more important to them than gun policy, right?
Sure. Yeah. There was a top line of three issues, but really it should have just been one issue because border security was orders of magnitude rated higher amongst voters than all the other issues. The economy was, I think, three times less likely for voters to say that was their number one issue. And that was the second highest represented
But Abbott leads on those issues too, I believe, in this poll.
He does. Yeah. The top three issues were border security, economy, and abortion. And believe it or not, Abbott led on all three. Yeah. So still doesn't bode that well for Mr. O'Rourke.
But so, I there's not a lot of good news coming out of Texas right now for Beto, but it's still very early in that campaign. He did get some good news in the form of Matthew McConaughey deciding not to run at all.
Sure.
So I don't know. We'll keep a track on the Democratic primary there to see if somebody else makes a good run to try and challenge him for the nomination. But obviously he has a lot of momentum on the Democratic side and has by far the biggest name ID of anyone running on the Democratic side, and is going to most likely raise the most money of any Democrat running. So that would be the good news, is that he's likely to pull off the nomination there, although you never know what'll happen. And then once you get to the general election and things get closer to the actual election, polls tend to tighten in most races. So We'll see where it goes. Obviously, he lost to a less popular Republican in Ted Cruz just recently. And so I don't know. It's hard to imagine what it is that's going to make him beat Greg Abbott, who's more popular and who still has a approval rating above water, if I'm correct on that, right?
That's what I was going to say. That's what is interesting, because for a while there, a couple months ago, you saw Abbott start to dip underwater a little bit, whereas popularity was down. Some people attributed that to maybe the winter storm that happened. Some people attributed it to maybe COVID handling. But as you said, this poll, he's well above water with independents and Republicans.
Yeah, so. I mean, it's not that Abbott is completely invulnerable in Texas, but it's also running Beto O'Rourke again. Whether that's going to be the strategy to unseat him is, I think, pretty highly questionable. He's a pretty far left on the political spectrum when it comes to Texas Democrats. And so, that probably motivates a lot of people outside of Texas. But the big question is, how does it motivate people inside of Texas? And so far, that hasn't been the case. And then even outside, I mean, he was at 0% in the Democratic presidential primary when he eventually dropped out.
Right.
So he started off way ahead. Actually, the very early polls, he did really well in that primary. And then he dropped down to the point where he's at literally 0 after making the confiscation declaration. So I don't know. It's an interesting race, at least. It's going to get a lot of attention. At this point, it doesn't seem like Beto's super competitive, but maybe that'll change.
Yep. You never know what can happen in a year. But speaking of governors of Republican states, Steve, you had a piece about something that's going on in Florida. You want to share it with us?
Yes, that's right. Ron DeSantis, the Republican governor of Florida, said that he would sign a permitless carry bill, just as Greg Abbott did in Texas, if it made it to his desk during a private GOP event where he was asked by a gun rights activist there. It was kind of a weird video. It looked like the guy was trying to it looked like DeSantis thought he was taking a picture with the activist, but it was really a video. But nonetheless, he did ask him directly if he would sign. This guy's with Florida Gun Rights, I believe, is the group, is part of the national. What is it? What's the name of that group? The Gun Rights.
It's the National Association of Gun Rights.
That's right. I think that's like a Ron Paul associated group. But they have a couple state chapters, and they have one in Florida. And the director of their Florida chapter went and did this. It was very odd, to be fair, where he asked them directly a very clear question, which was whether he'd sign permitless carry, or as activists call it, constitutional carry, into law if it made it to his desk. And DeSantis said, of course. And then, obviously, because of the nature of the video, I asked DeSantis's people for clarification on this point, and they said yes. They didn't dispute anything in the video, is how they said it. But his spokesperson, was it Christine Pashaw? I hope I pronounced her name right. Sorry if not. But she said that the video, he didn't dispute anything in the video as far as the governor's position, but obviously he would have to see the specific text of an actual bill before he could commit to supporting any particular proposal. But she did point out at the same time that the majority leader of the Senate down there had already made comments supportive of constitutional carry. And so when the new session comes in January, I think it's fairly likely that you'll see some sort of permitless carry bill get brought up. Now, how much DeSantis puts into pushing that bill, or where it goes from getting introduced, is obviously a big open question. But I don't know. What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. As you said, we've heard some rumblings down there from state elected officials before talking about introducing constitutional carry. It'll be interesting just because of where DeSantis is as a politician at the moment. He's obviously either up for re-election for governor, or, people have tossed his name out there as a potential presidential candidate. Yeah. So we'll have to see what he thinks maybe the political baggage or the political boon that a constitutional carry type bill will be. I think the fact that Texas, being a large Republican state with a lot of urban areas, the fact that they've passed such a bill, I think helps the odds in Florida. Because they don't have to go out on a limb and be the first big state to pass that law. Yeah. So I think it'll be really interesting to watch. I think there's a lot of momentum in Republican circles for permitless carry right now. I mean, you had 5 states pass it this year alone, 5 red states, including Texas. You've seen Ohio's House pass it. You've seen Pennsylvania's legislature pass it. Now, it just got vetoed in Pennsylvania because they have a Democratic governor. Right. But that's interesting. I mean, Pennsylvania is more of a swing state, a purple state. It's trending red right now, but it's been more of a swing state for the last several decades. And so they passed it. So what's Florida going to do? That Florida is one of the few remaining states. I believe Georgia is another one. There's a couple still left that have triple red governments where Republicans control the legislature and the governorship, but don't have constitutional carry or permitless carry. So I think that leaves people like Ron DeSantis vulnerable in a primary
election, potentially, if he doesn't get behind that policy and Florida doesn't pass it when he goes to run for president, which seems almost inevitable at this point. Obviously, you have former President Trump and all of the stuff that he likes to say and do, and who knows what he's going to end up doing. And he's still very popular with a lot of Republican voters, but DeSantis hasn't rolled out running even against him. So he's definitely one of the prime candidates for the Republicans. And it seems like he feels pressured to support this policy now. And I think that has a lot to do with the momentum that's been built up by gun rights activists, from the NRA to GOA to, this is the local state groups in Pennsylvania and Texas and these other states, Ohio, that have pushed this bill this year. And so I think that's an interesting development. It's definitely something I think we're going to have to keep watching, and we'll have to see what happens in Florida, right? I mean, it's not a guarantee that it's going to pass there. It hasn't passed yet. Florida actually has some pretty weird combination of laws. I mean, Texas used to kind of be this way too, where it had this reputation of being very pro-gun, but had a lot of laws that were stricter than even Pennsylvania or Virginia or a number of other states. So Texas has kind of moved past that now and has some of the most gun-friendly laws in the country, if you want to. I don't know what the proper way of phrasing this is, but they've removed some of the restrictions that they had. Obviously, they removed the permitting process for concealed carry. And now Texas, now maybe Florida's going to be pushed to do the same thing. I mean, they just passed a number of gun control bills just a couple of years ago after Parkland. So it'll be a pretty interesting whiplash scenario there if they go from passing laws that restrict anyone under 21 from owning most guns to then going to permitless gun carry, while they also still have a waiting period for handgun purchases. It's a very eclectic collection of gun laws in Florida. So we'll have to see if this makes it through. Obviously, there's a lot of, all politics is local to a certain degree still. And so Florida, they call it the gunshine state, right? But they have a number of policies that are stricter than most red states when it comes to guns.
They do.
So we'll keep an eye on that, though, moving forward for sure, because it's going to be one of the bigger stories in gun politics through the next year or so. But yeah, I think that's all we've got for you this week. Remember, if you want to get this podcast a day early, or you want to get exclusive access to members-only pieces on thereload.com, you can head on over there and buy a membership today. We've got $10 per month or $100 per year. So if you buy the yearly, you get 2 months effectively for free. And we also have a lifetime membership available for those who want to do that extra bit to support our reporting, because this is a 100% reader-funded publication. It is completely independent. And the only way to keep it that way and to keep us operating is through the support of our members. So please consider doing that today. And we will talk to you guys again real soon.